Today, Australia's housing costs go ballistic. Hi again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, where I'm latest post covering finance and property news. It's Friday, and I'm pleased to say that Tarric is back for another chat. Tarric, welcome back.
Thanks, mate. It's great to be here.
And this is an interesting conversation, specifically on the housing angle. I have to say that the amount of doublespeak that is out there at the moment is just getting higher and higher and higher. And the more that people say housing wealth is increasing, everybody's fine, nothing to see here, and then I look at the data, I'm thinking you're further and further and further and further from the truth. It must be deliberate.
Well, it's funny that, like you look at the numbers, say from Cotality, the artist formerly known as CoreLogic was recently kind enough to share their vacancy rate data with me going back almost 2 decades. And you look at their numbers and you look at their press releases, and it's the vacancy rates are the lowest they've been on since their records began, and significantly lower than when their data set began. And I just think it's funny that this doesn't rate more of a mention. Like, this is a crisis. This is, people struggling to pay rent. This is people struggling to get rentals. This is vulnerable people stuck in bad situations that they can't escape because of rental availability and the cost of rents. And it's rather funny that we have a left-wing government that is meant to care about all these things. And it just sort of, oh, well, cost of doing business, and here's a report saying that it's going to get worse.
Well, I can tell you something. I have been doing quite a lot of work specifically on the rental sector of the market. In my surveys, I see that coming through. And I have some very rich data on the pressures on renters. And I've been pushing this around a few of the media outlets in recent weeks. And do you know what they all say? This isn't news. And I'm thinking, well, why isn't it news? This is one of the most critical things that is actually affecting real Australians at the moment. And yet it doesn't seem to warrant a mention. Now, of course, every time anything to do with mortgages comes up or mortgage stress, they are all over it, right? But the rental stress story, and remember, in my surveys, 75% of those in the rental sector have cash flow pressures. 75%, 3/4. And yet, the journalists say, no, nothing to see here. This is just, it's always been that way. No, it hasn't. Look at it. The trends are that it's much higher than it was. So there is a problem in having a real conversation about something which I think is probably the most serious socio and economic issue that we face.
Well, it's a challenging one, isn't it? I mean, it's something, I read an article about this, I think it was last weekend over at news.com, on how basically the rental crisis is continuing. That's where I got the data from Cotality for. But it's just sad that it doesn't rate more of a mention. And I think that part of the problem is that I think people have become desensitized to it. They've become numb to it, because it's just like, how is it after, what is it, almost 4.5 years now of rental crisis in some capacity in somewhere in the country, that this is still going on? Well, then when you look at Canada, you look at New Zealand, you look at the United States, you look at all these other Anglosphere countries that have had rental crisis issues, rental availability issues, and it's been over for years in some cases. In the US, it's been over now for almost 3, as of just early next year, it'll be over for 3 years for them. And you look at, rents in Canada falling. You look at rents in New Zealand falling. You look at rents in high migration reliant markets. According to an analysis from TD Economics, those areas are absolutely plummeting. You're seeing, in some cases, double-digit falls in the cost of rents. And here we are here in Australia, and you look at the latest data from Cotality, and rental growth is reaccelerating again. And that's just completely bucking the trend seeing throughout most of the rest of the Anglosphere.
Well, I think that's right. And of course, the other thing that I do is I look at the rental costs in the context of other housing and other household expenditure categories too. And the other unique thing that Australia has now is that the cost of energy for a lot of those in the rental sector has never been higher as a proportion of income. We also know, of course, that food prices are still rising quite strongly. We know that medical expenditure is also rising to the point where some people are now not just going to the doctors or the dentist because they can't afford to. And so across the board, when you put it all together, and you know, I come back to this simple idea that when you're talking about a household, you need to understand the money coming in and the money going out. The rental element is part of a bigger picture. But when you actually put it all together, what you can see is that the failure of policy over a long, long time across multiple categories are all biting. And who's it biting the most? It's biting those in the rental sector.
You know, it's funny you should mention that, because a while ago I did this analysis based on ABS household spending. Now, this data set goes all the way back to, you know, a rather inauspicious date, 1984, and it charts it measures what Australians were spending on different classes of expenditure across the last, I think it's about 32 years of data they have, until it just stops in 2016, which is very, very disappointing. And the current expected date of the next installment is TBA. Or actually, no, I think it actually says unknown. But suffice to say, it's a very, very rich, very, very good data source that tells you how much households are spending at the aggregate. Now, this isn't as arguably as handy as per capita numbers, but it does tell you how much, say, for example, housing is acting as a drag on the economy. And what it found is that in 1984, Australian households spent a little over 14% of their total spending on housing costs. Now, you fast forward that to 2015-16, which is the last snapshot on record, and on that count, it's risen by almost 10 percentage points. So that's 10 percentage points worth of household spending that's no longer going towards towards other things to flow through the economy. So instead, more household spending is going to the bank in the form of mortgage repayments, or it's also going to the bank in the form of paying a landlord who tends to be negatively geared, who then needs to pay their mortgage. So you're not seeing that virtuous cycle of someone going out, going to a gym, paying a personal trainer, who then goes to pay a hairdresser, who then goes to pay a barista, and so on and so forth. That virtuous cycle of cash sloshing and flowing through the economy. And I mean, I can only imagine, looking at your data, how much that drag on household spending has expanded in the best part of the last decade.
Well, it's definitely expanded a lot. And by the way, the cost of tolls is also another one that people are not covering off. Remember, a lot of people now are choosing or being forced to live further away from the CBDs, particularly in, say, Sydney and Melbourne. And so cost of travel, whether it's actually driving or whether you actually use public transport, is also very high as well. And that's something else that, again, because of policy, is biting very hard. And you're right, insofar that if you've got a certain pool of money coming in, and real incomes really have hardly changed, as we'll see a little later, I think, what it means is a greater proportion of things are going on what you have to spend money on, you know, the so-called non-discretionary items, and which, of course, is where the ABS recently reported that non-discretionary spending increased again. Why? Because the costs of those are going up. But discretionary items, as an aggregate level, are not moving up anything like as fast. Now, when you actually overlay another lens, which is what I can also do through my segmentation, what is clear is that this is not something that all households are experiencing. And there are some households whose income have grown and whose expenditure relative to everything else is still relatively benign, which means they can spend quite a lot more, particularly if they're older, by the way. So we have this, you know, we've spoken about it before, this sort of K, you know, some people doing well, some people not. The point I want to make, though, is that the gravity well around those who are not doing well is expanding and expanding and expanding. And nothing that anyone has been doing really has helped. Now, you know, you could argue that the energy subsidies briefly helped, but of course they're rolling off now. We'll probably extend them slightly just to sort of paint over the crack a little bit longer. But the truth is that this is actually now such a structural issue in the economy that there was almost no chance of real economic momentum reasserting itself for some time to come. And so we've got this doom loop going on at the moment. And yet, when you watch and listen to the economists and how they are diagnosing the economy, it's like, which economy are you looking at?
Well, I think the thing is that it's very much viewed in headline terms. I mean, you and I tend to focus on the granular, on the per capita. Although, to be completely frank, the headline numbers really aren't all that crash hot either. I mean, okay, you've got relatively low unemployment, which is definitely a welcome thing. But you look at, say, headline growth. Headline growth of under 2% is hardly, setting the world on fire. And not only that, but I did a bit of analysis recently based on the size of government over time. So we're talking about, instead of focusing, like a lot of analysis focuses on government more broadly. Now, I don't think that's very fair, because if you go back, you see all these governments, Menzies, Hawke, etc., spending big dollars on infrastructure, which distorts things. So what I did is I focused solely on day-to-day government expenditure, not on public investment. And what I found was that during a recession, you tend to see a surge in the size of government as a proportion of GDP. Now, that's because the government is acting as a, counter-cyclical buffer for the economy. So they're spending to support the economy, but it's also the fact that at the same time, the private sector is overwhelmingly contracting. So I went through about 50 years of data since the 1970s and on government as a proportion of GDP during recessions and other, calamitous events, shall we say. And what I found was that government tends to grow by somewhere around about 2 to 3 percentage points of GDP as a proportion of GDP. Now, that is when, like, say, for example, during the 1990s recession, when unemployment went into double digits and it was full panic stations. Yet we have seen a 2 percentage point rise in the size of government since Anthony Albanese was elected, and it's just business as usual. Now, if we compare that to another sort of challenging event, the global financial crisis, when Kevin Rudd threw the kitchen sink at the economy in order to support it to, sort of weather the storm, the expansion of government as a proportion of GDP is less than half of what we've seen under Anthony Albanese, even though this is just regular, day-to-day, move along, nothing to see here. And, Kevin Rudd was dealing with, the biggest economic crisis since the Great Depression.
Yes, and that, of course, is why the overall debt burden that the government is now carrying is very high, which, of course, translates into high interest rate charges for longer. Bond yields, of course, are also now a little bit more extended than a lot of people thought they would be, which means that the cost of that debt is also quite a lot higher. And I know that people are saying, well, the economy is doing a little better because maybe we've exported a little bit more than we thought we were going to do, etc., and the price of iron ore was a little bit better. But the math doesn't work when you actually think about what we're getting for all that extra investment that the government is spending. Because, as you rightly said, this is now normal course of business stuff. This isn't, emergency finger in the dike stuff that we'll do briefly and then it will pull away. It has become structural now, so that effectively the proportion of the total economy that is actually government supported, directly or indirectly, is, almost as high as it's ever been. And the cost of that, of course, hits taxpayers, which is why the tax take is still a lot higher than it was previously. It's hitting the capacity of the government to do things because they're having to service more debt. And then overlay that, the increased commitment to things like defence and other things too. And you scratch your head thinking, well, hang on a moment, how is this budget going to work ahead? And that's why structural deficits into the future look like a recipe for the day.
Indeed. And I think just on the issue of the labour market in particular, it leaves Australia so very, very vulnerable. Because we have this issue whereby we're employing all these extra people, like things like the NDIS is getting bigger. all of these various government, so for example, the government agency that manages the NDIS is getting bigger. The public service wage in Victoria is rocketing. There's all these different elements. But as the role of government gets larger and larger and larger and larger, the risks start to build because, one, if you stop that growth, the labor market then has to stand on its own, and that's a risk in and of itself. But then if you really start to confront some challenging times and you're then forced to either cut other forms of government spending or reduce the headcount of individuals who have their employment funded by the taxpayer in some capacity, then you end up facing a challenge like good old Rachel Reeves is right now in Britain.
Yes, well, I was going to mention the UK. Of course, growth there is a measly 0.1% at the moment, right? The unemployment rate's now knocking on 5%, and the government debt is through the roof. And so she's now having to effectively capitulate on her three promises to not increase basic income tax, the VAT or GST, and the other one, which is national insurance, which is the third element of tax that really is another income tax. So in 2 weeks' time, they're going to actually turn out and say, no, we're going to have to put those up now because, well, we can't make the spending work. And she will blame global events, the Trump trade issue or the gas crisis in, whatever, or the previous government, although that, of course, is now running out of excuse time because they've been in power for quite some time now. But actually, if you look through that, there are a series of, again, the same structural issues where we've got a bigger government employing more people, becoming less and less efficient, and delivering, well, less and less, actually. There's more potholes and there's, more waiting lists and all those things. So the basic philosophical structure in the minds of the politicians, you've got to bring into question, what are they there for? And okay, you say, well, firstly, of course, I want to get re-elected. Yes, but if you are going to get re-elected, then you need to be doing things that actually are going to make people's lives better. And I would argue that in the UK and in Australia, governments over the last few years have managed to do precisely the opposite.
Well, exactly. And I think that's one of the key things is that I think if we were using that money that government is deploying on, say, frontline services, and things were improving at the coalface for the Australian people, I think that we could much more seriously justify that. And not only that, but say, for example, if you improved health outcomes, via greater numbers of health workers, that would have a positive impact on tax revenue, on productivity, and on the broader economy. But we're not doing that. I was just looking just before at a chart of the number of hours spent with ambulance ramping in Adelaide, and it's, well, record seasonal highs.
No.
And it's just ridiculous because we're spending all this money, and for what? We're not seeing that improvement at the coalface for everyday Australians. And that's something that occurred in Britain during the the era of austerity and since, because you look at, say, for example, the number of policemen on the street or the number of firemen, these people in vital frontline services. There's fewer of them now than there was a decade ago, and that is just an absolute indictment of just the priorities of government in Britain and government in Australia. We're employing all of these people, and is it improving things for the average person? No, but it's costing an absolute heap to do it. I mean, the truly insane thing to me is that spending an extra 2% worth of GDP is an absolute shed load of money. You're talking about over $50 billion a year. Like, the things that you could do with $50 billion, like if you want to build whatever your personal priority is, you can make it happen for $50 billion a year. You want to go nuclear, you can do that. You want to mass build public housing, you can do that. Whatever you want to do with over $50 billion, is you can make it work.
Absolutely, it's big numbers, and when you think about the whole philosophy of government and what they choose to spend their money on, and they've always got excuses, of course. There's this come up or that come up. The truth is that their priorities seem to me, well, pretty flaky, frankly. And even the prospect of getting re-elected then starts to, look less certain. It's interesting that both in the UK and in Australia, there's now a lot more interest in other smaller parties. In other words, both the big parties are just saying, "Oh, they're the same." They're not actually credible, and that then opens the door on a lot of other players. In some cases with good policies, in some cases with no policies, but the gift of the gab. And what that suggests then is the political process itself is getting corrupted too.
It's interesting you should mention that. Did you happen to see the poll? I think it might have been this morning, UK time, or late last night, but it showed that between Reform and the UK Green Party, that they were now the two highest parties polling in some of the recent data.
Yes.
And Reform in that poll as well. Well, one, the Greens were polling higher than the Tories or Labor, and Reform was polling higher than Labor and the Tories combined. So, I mean, that's like existential numbers in a first past the post electoral system.
Yes, and of course, Farage, who's leading that particular party, has a few top-level sort of notes that he sort of, speaks to, but there isn't much below it in terms of actually policy detail. And in fact, I think it's almost deliberate, because it's a bit like some of the Trumpism that we saw, with a lot of splurging and big promises, but nothing below it. And it's worrying, really, because the chances are in the upcoming elections next May, that's the next council elections, the regional elections in the UK, Farage is going to do extremely well. And both of the major parties are now running very scared, thinking, oh, well, he's now in a position to significantly influence the agenda and the debate. And what's fascinating to me is that the mainstream media are now struggling with, how do we actually present this? He's a party that's got only a small vote currently, but the polls suggest he will be a lot bigger later. So how much coverage should we be giving him is the interesting question now. And what's starting to happen is that he's getting more and more coverage because the media is now following the trend.
Well, realistically, I mean, they have to. I mean, they've, obviously various polls, have a relatively wide range of outcomes, but I mean, realistically, Reform is somewhere from the sort of like mid 20s up to, some say as high as about 35% of the vote. Now, don't get me wrong, in some countries that wouldn't be enough. But in a first past the post electoral system, which is as fragmented as it is in Britain, then it's more than enough to get elected. I mean, the big question now is, if you magically held a general election based on those polls, it would be, how big is his majority?
Yep.
And to be completely honest with you, I sort of just see Reform as a little bit like One Nation, but on steroids. And One Nation has got quite a lot of people elected over the years, but it's had trouble with holding their party together once those people have been elected. And I think that that there is a fair chance of Farage having the same similar issue in Britain. And yes, we've already seen that to a degree with some of the Reform politicians that have been elected, with people getting into trouble, or various infighting. And I mean, if they emerge as this enormous party in absolute ascendancy, I can only imagine the absolute just mess of infighting that could erupt with it, given that generally these people are not experienced political operators. They're people who are passionate people who are chosen for to be elevated. And I don't think that's inherently a bad thing. But the person who is managing the party has to be able to channel that debate and channel those opinions into something cohesive that they can then act upon, rather than it all just imploding as it has before for some other upstart parties.
Well, it's very interesting, because last May, some of the reform people got elected to local councils in a few places across the country. And one of their commitments was to create a Doge type program within those councils, claiming that they'd be able to save a lot of money immediately. And it's interesting that now, a few months later, they're starting to actually admit that actually it's a bit harder than just saying we're going to create a Doge, when they actually look at, so which spending are you going to cut then? Is it going to be schools, or is it going to be roads, or, and they were talking about downsizing some of the public sector. Okay, so which jobs are you going to actually dispose of? And what they're discovering is that when you're in power, it's a little bit more complicated than just, a 3-sentence program that you can actually propagate through the campaign. So, the older adage of words and figures differ now with regard to what they said they were going to do and what they're actually doing, because actually real life is quite a lot harder.
Well, that's the thing with government. I mean, and it's also just, I mean, it's a little bit like, yes, Prime Minister, really. It's the entropy of and the inertia of the public sector of, I mean, of to use something that some people might be aware of, the issues with the Peter principle. And I think one of the problems is that governments don't really like cutting spending, because it means that they have to deal with angry people. It means they have to deal with, because everything has consequences. Like you could tomorrow realistically cut, 5% of a workforce, people who are, basically, in some cases by their own admission, not worth the money that they're paid. But if you cut 5% of a workforce, that's a lot of people. Those people are going to be angry. Those people vote. Those people spend. So there's all these consequences that you have to deal with. And that's one of the issues with Doge in America and other pushes to cut spending. Because once you start really slashing things, once you really start cutting headcounts, all of a sudden you start having unintended consequences. Like if you could magically cut the US government workforce, I'm not talking about the federal government, but just government in general in the US by, say, 5%, I have a hard time seeing how that doesn't turn into a feedback loop of people, of greater unemployment and a potential recession. Just because that's just how economies function, because these people all spend and, the economic cycle plays out, what do they call it? The velocity of money.
Exactly right. And interestingly, I was involved some years ago with a couple of big agencies, I won't say which agencies, in Australia, actually Canberra-related agencies. And we were talking with them about their plans. And one of the things that they said in one meeting was they were about 3 months away from the end of the financial year, and they were beginning to put their plans in for the next year. And they were looking at ways to spend the money they hadn't yet spent. And the reason for that is that the next year's budget is baselined off what they actually spent this year. And the last thing you do as a public servant is actually underspend, because if you underspend, your budget next year will be lower. So there is a natural intent to sort of spend as much as you can so that you get a bit more next year and the next year and the next year. And that mentality I found really shocking. Having worked in the private sector for many, many years, when a lot of business leaders are always trying to nickel and dime and reduce budgets and spend less. The public sector mentality is the precise opposite. I'll spend my budget so that I can get more budget next year.
I feel like I need a prop glass of brandy here and just embrace my inner Sir Humphrey and say, but of course, Bernard.
Yeah, well, I've often said that Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister are the best parliamentary documentaries that have ever been done, because it is rather true. Now, as we sort of meander through this conversation, let's just take it slightly in a different direction now, because one of the things that we've been talking about is households and housing. I know you've done some work specifically on the whole question of the cost of housing, which of course is pretty disastrous. So let's get those slides up. And we're going to start with this one, Tarric, which when I first read it, I said I thought it was the government shit down, but no, it's the government shutdown. Now we lack data. It's like driving in the fog. And I was already lost. And I think that's a rather neat way to start this because, of course, yes, we are in a fog.
Well, we are indeed. As always, the charts are available at burnouteconomics.com. All subscribers and messages of support and contributions are very, very welcome. And I would just like to say a big thank you to everyone who has already subscribed and sent messages of support. I really, really do appreciate it. And we'll get straight into the slides. Now, what I've done here is taken the data from the RBA and CoreLogic / Cotality, as they're now known, and worked out what household income do you need in order to buy the median house across all these various locales and not be in technical mortgage stress, which is 30% of gross household income. Now, just a few things about the settings on this. This is taken based on the interest rates in May 2022 and October 2025. Now, this is based on the average payable owner-occupier variable rate, which I've got that data from the RBA. It's also based on the idea that the individual has 20% deposit to purchase the house. Maybe I should do it again for one with 5% deposit, and also has the required cash for the various transfer fees, conveyancing, stamp duty, etc. And it's not a pretty picture. You're talking about basically almost double median household income in much of the country these days.
Yeah, and I'll just highlight that a significant move up from 2022 to 2025. Remember, 2022 is after the COVID sort of cycle sort of shook out. So this is a relatively small period of time for a significant rise. And the other point that is worth highlighting, I think, Tarric, is that more and more people now are absolutely reliant on 2 full incomes to be able to actually try and meet this. But in my calculations, I look at taxable income, in other words, after-tax income rather than before tax, because, of course, the tax take is higher than it was. And when you do that, it becomes 30 to 40 to 45 to even 50% of available income required to be able to get that mortgage for many people. And going back to what we said earlier on, that means they've got a lot less money to spend on everything else.
Indeed. And I think it's just worth noting with this is that I haven't actually taken the sort of ideal interest rate on offer in 2022. Now, if you had have gone and tried to get a fixed rate mortgage, one of the cheapy 3-year jobs, either in May or perhaps a little bit earlier, then the figure required would be even lower. So in terms of, and not only that, but the people buying in May 2022, first fixed rate mortgages were still all the rage back then. So in a lot of ways, the actual functional cost has risen even to an even greater degree because of that intervention by the RBA and their little fiddling with the term funding facility.
Yes, absolutely. And the interesting observation here is that the banks clearly have to do some calculation on affordability. So what assumption are they now making with regard to their affordability calculations and, the HEM or whatever you want to talk about to be able to say, yeah, it's fine. You can afford it. It's interesting that APRA and the RBA have been talking more recently about some concerns about the impact on household budgets of rising house prices, but also in the recent statement on monetary policy, they also showed that a rise in house prices was good for GDP. So they're being pulled in 2 directions.
Yeah, I don't think that the RBA acknowledges sufficiently the drag on the economy that is derived from higher housing costs. That we talked about earlier, that extra, 10 plus percentage points of household spending that now just, just disappears on housing. And the impact it has on that. Because I think it's funny because the RBA talks about, the wealth effect, but then they also talk about the lack of productivity growth. and the lack of, sort of innovation and small business growth and all those sorts of things that you really need to be seeing in a vibrant, capable economy. Whereas instead, the focus is just on house price go up, people spend more, and not really on the sort of granular effect that has on an economy and on a society, because the people who are spending are the people with the assets. They're not the other people at the bottom end, at the bottom end, the bottom rungs of society, who are generally younger and generally seeing, their spending either stagnate or decline. And I mean, you could literally put up a headline that says depression in spending for 25 to 29-year-olds and have it be entirely technically correct, because spending for that cohort in real terms has fallen by more than 10%, by more than 10%. And that is, by some definitions, a technical depression.
Absolutely. Well, I see it in my surveys. There's different cohorts. Some spending quite freely, particularly older. Some's not spending at all because they can't. And worryingly, a lot of people spending, but on borrowed time, meaning that they've got more credit card debt. So the overall credit card debt's rising at the moment. And a lot of people have multiple credit cards. They're using buy now, pay later and other forms of credit as well to try and get by. And the other observation, Tarric, is that some of these younger cohorts have been introduced to debt very early, through the university funding and everything like that. And the lack of financial education in schools mean a lot of people don't actually understand the consequences of all this debt. So we've actually built a couple of generations now who have their whole well-being anchored in massive amounts of debt, and with an expectation that that's going to be the way they're going to be for a lot of their entire life. And if you do a quick calculation on a 50-year mortgage, which of course Trump floated the other day, and the average first-time buyer, who could be just a little bit below 40 now, well, you're going to be seriously in debt right through retirement and, well, almost the entire time. Now, who are the winners? The banks, of course, because they actually can generate more income for their shareholders, and a lot of that shareholder returns go offshore, because a lot of the banks in Australia are actually funding foreign shareholders rather than local shareholders. But it also means that people are indoctrinated into thinking that, well, debt is just part of the furniture and nothing I can do about it, which I'm quite concerned about, because actually I think that's a bit of a false path.
Well, I think it's funny, if you go on, Reddit or, some of these other, forums for people discussing, purchasing a home and stuff like that, the number of pieces of advice that people get that basically just say, borrow as much as you possibly can and then just figure it out, is just is mind-boggling. And the thing is I understand why people give that advice, because property price go up, and if you don't buy the thing that's as close as you want, that is as close as you possibly can to the thing that you actually want, there's a risk that you could miss out on, a stepping stone to that. Because, like, there is a huge number of people who were given a blueprint by their parents, by society, by other people, that says, buy a property, pay down the property, get some equity, you'll be able to buy a house. Now, a lot of people did that. A lot of people bought apartments because that was all they could afford. And now they've bought those apartments. The growth has been, in some cases, relatively anemic, or, maybe towards the better end of the spectrum, decent, but nowhere near as potent as it has been for detached houses. And for a lot of people, they're not really any closer, despite paying down debt, despite working their ass off, despite growing their income, they're not any closer today to buying that house than they were when they started it. So I think that that's one of those things that I think is really underappreciated from just a multitude of different perspectives, both from an economic perspective, but also from a social and a political perspective. Because, it's said that for young people to become conservatives, they have to have something worth conserving. And an apartment that you don't want, is it really worth conserving? Especially if you want a house for you and your family.
Good point. And the other little twist that I quite often see on those various forums is to say, well, if you think about it, the value of the debt's going to be inflated away. So it's not really as bad as it sounds until you actually do some thinking about, well, what's real incomes done over the same period, right? Because you would expect, if that were true, then you would actually be better off relative to the debt that you've got. But actually, many people aren't, as perhaps we will see. The other angle on all of this, of course, is that those in the rental sector are actually also struggling too. And unfortunately, we're seeing a greater proportion of people who are not able to enter the property market at the moment and are being forced into the rental sector. Got no choice for that. But we have another problem there because the amount of property that's around is, well, ridiculously low, isn't it?
Indeed. And on that, we have this is the chart I was talking about from CoreLogic. And just a little FYI, this particular metric is not seasonally adjusted. The seasonally adjusted metric is at record lows, as confirmed by their recent press release on this. But as you can see, rental vacancy rates back in the mid-2000s used to be in a very, very different world to where they are now. And then the big Australian migration intake happened. Rents skyrocketed, vacancy rates collapsed, and they found a completely different equilibrium. It's also worth noting that when rental vacancy rates were north of 7%, that's when household formation rates for people aged 25 to 34 peaked. So there's a very real, very visceral reaction within society to rental vacancy rates, to rental affordability, that just echoes throughout the ages.
Absolutely. Well, I bang on about household formation ages quite often because it has a consequence, right? It means that if people aren't actually forming households, they don't actually think about kids until a lot later, and then they have less kids. And that is one of the reasons why the birth rate is so low, which means that, of course, then the government says, we need to bring the migration numbers up to be able to actually offset the lower homegrown segment. But as we said, previous ones, there's a big difference, right? If you have kids, you can plan schools and other things that they'll need ahead. Whereas if you bring a whole bunch of migrants in, you need them yesterday. And I also noted that the most recent arrivals and departures data, which of course everybody says, no, it's nothing to do with migration, created a little bit of a heat wave on on Twitter or X for you, Tarric.
Yeah, it's becoming relatively common, actually. And it's rather funny because I'm not the only person who posts that. Like, there's a bunch of other economists, who are, frankly, far more notable than myself, who post it regularly. But, here we are. And yes, okay, it's not net overseas migration. It's net long-term and permanent arrivals. It is a directional leading indicator. And that's what it's used for by the federal government. But I think one of the funny things is that it's just with, for example, with the rental market, is that it's about that equilibrium. It's about how household formation changes over time and how that impacts things. Like, say, for example, a 3% rental vacancy rate in 2008 was an absolute disaster. Rocketing rents, people missing out on homes. But then by the same token, a 3% rental vacancy rate in 2019 was, rents have been flat now for about 3 years, 4 years, I mean, okay, there's a bit of growth, but relatively flat overall. And that's as a result of household formation changing, as a result of people choosing to forego forming a household. And, we saw that, as I mentioned, in that drop around about the GFC, and then we've seen that again more recently. And I just think that it's rather funny that these things don't get the focus that they deserve. Like, the government talks about housing affordability. It talks about, Australians living the way that they want to live their lives, the way they choose. And then they turn around and they just go, yeah, but we're going to make housing more expensive though. And that's not, and just for the record, for the viewers, that's not like me being glib. That's actually what Claire O'Neill told Triple J last December. Or November. It was either November or December. You can find a clip of it relatively easily.
Yeah, I actually focused on it at the time because I thought it was pretty astonishing. And the other interesting observation, just on government policy, the Housing Future Fund, which is this 10 billion that they've put aside and are trying to actually use it to help, as Andrew Bragg revealed in Senates the other day, about a third of the stuff that they've actually acquired, they've actually bought property already built. So they're actually competing with the first-time buyers who are also trying to get into the market rather than actually building new stuff, which I think is amazing. And why? Because they're desperate to show that they're actually increasing the numbers. Because last time around there was almost nothing in the positive column of what they've done. So the whole Housing Future Fund looks to me to be another of those government initiatives. We're here to help you, when in fact really they're not.
Honestly, if you take a step back and you look at public housing, say let's say over the last 40 odd years, let's say since the election of the Hawke government in 1983, right? It's been on a downtrend now basically since the early 90s. But if you look at the proportion of new housing completions coming from, destined for destined for public housing, it's plummeted over time. Except there is an exception. Under the Rudd government, following the GFC, they built an absolute heap of new public housing. You're talking about, I think, just off the top of my head, it was about 8% of dwelling completions. Now, in one quarter. Now, under Albo, I think it topped out at about 1.4. And this is the big, we're going to potentially fight a double dissolution election over this. And it's like, for what? You've absolutely dismally failed to get to a tiny fraction of what was achieved under the Rudd government, well within living memory, and you're an absolute shell of what the Hawke government achieved back in the day. And there's absolutely zero sign of anything approaching that level being achieved. And I just think it's frankly pathetic because they're selling a narrative that is not true, basically, definitively, because the amount of housing stock that is public and social housing is falling. It's not rising, despite the fact that they just make a big song and dance about it.
Yeah, and there was a bit of media coverage right at the beginning of October when this 5% deposit trick was actually brought in early. And you may remember the photograph of Albo and O'Neill with a new property owner, pretty much right at the beginning of October, as though somehow magically that change in October had created that opportunity. No, it was a photo op that had been staged. That transaction would have been made some months ago because it takes time for transactions to go through. But again, this is all about being seen to be doing things rather than doing things. It's about performance politics rather than real outcomes. And I'm getting pretty tired of all this performance politics and housing because it just goes on and on and on.
Indeed, and I think it was really disappointing to see Claire O'Neill talk about the fact that, oh well, if the coalition was in power, and I paraphrase here, if the coalition was in power, this 140,000 odd people who've purchased homes under the Albanese government through all the various support mechanisms wouldn't have happened. And I just felt like saying that is a load of crap, because up until the changes enacted by the Albanese government with the 5% deposit scheme, the home guarantee scheme is basically persisting as legislated by the Morrison government. So they haven't really done a whole lot of anything up until then on that particular avenue. And that is the avenue that has delivered the vast majority of that 140,000 people. Now, I don't personally like the home guarantee scheme very much. I personally think it's putting upward pressure on demand. But by the same token, I don't necessarily think it's a bad idea conceptually. If, for example, to take a trip down memory lane to the late 1940s, early 1950s, the Menzies government did a similar thing. It was a brilliant success. You know why? Because Menzies got a giant sledgehammer and he clobbered the crap out of property investors, and the number of property investors in the market plummeted. Except there's no willingness to do that here, nor is there the willingness to engage in the other prong of Menzies' very successful strategy that delivered the highest home ownership rate in the history of this country, which is building dramatically more homes.
No, absolutely. Well, there's a supply and a demand aspect on this. And it's interesting, the Productivity Commission earlier on, when they looked at this, suggested that actually the schemes that were in place were bringing forward purchases for people who would have already been able to purchase just a little bit delayed. It wasn't actually tackling the fundamental structural issue of housing unaffordability for those who really need the help. So it's not even, the spotlight isn't even turning on the right sort of segment of the population, in my view. And then going on to the investor story, well, just look at the latest investment data. You've got a chart there, which is just an astonishing amount of growth of investor lending relative to previous.
Indeed. Now, this we'll sort of do this as a little bit of a dual chart show here. And what this is from a 2003 paper from the Federal Treasury, and it shows the number of new mortgages flowing to property investors as a proportion of total housing finance. Now, it's worth noting that historically, between around about the 1960s and the mid 1990s, the proportion of homes of occupied dwelling stock owned by property investors hovered in a very tight range around about 18% of overall occupied dwelling stock. So you would expect for, obviously investors come and go from the market. So you would expect an equilibrium point for that to be somewhere, somewhere in that sort of ballpark. But as you can see from this chart, the meteoric rise of property investors really kicked off after the 1990s recession. And it continued higher and higher and higher and higher until it was over 40% of new mortgages. Now, it dropped back after that, but as you'll see in the next chart, which charts it from the time of the election of the Albanese government, it has undergone a striking resurgence. And according to the current ABS dataset, which admittedly only goes back to 2019, it's now at record highs, both in dollar value terms and in terms of the proportion of actual loans written. And currently, 40% of new mortgage credit is flowing to property investors, which indicates rather clearly that the investor share of housing is growing and growing significantly, which means the share held by regular Australian owner occupiers is in all likelihood falling.
Right, and two observations there. It's very interesting when you look at which property investors are buying more properties. Predominantly, it's property investors with multiple properties already. Plus, there's a small proportion of prospective first-time buyers who aren't able to buy a first-time buyer property because they can't find anything. So they're using it as a proxy to try and actually create a bit of wealth to be able to buy later. So that's where the sort of the two growth areas are. And of the two, it's the first that's by far the biggest. The second observation is that APRA, about a month, 6 weeks ago, warned the banks about the growth in investment lending and was saying, we might have to do something. Michelle Bullock, in the interview recently, or in the press conference recently, mentioned it as a potential risk. And in the Statement of Monetary Policy, it's also mentioned there. So the question is now, will the regulators push back again in the past couple of decades? Once it got into the sort of the 40 plus, APRA did actually intervene and push the limits a bit differently. But of course, there are only guidelines, and banks still have a freedom to make their own economic and policy decisions. So it's not really a very strong incentive to dial it back.
Well, I just think it's funny, I watched a recording of this interview with Anthony Albanese from 2019 when he appeared. I believe it was either on Sunrise or Today. It was on morning breakfast television. And he talked about, the need for affordable housing, about the need for housing prices to be more accessible to young people, the vitalness of it for society, which is not an uncommon thing. I mean, that's something that goes back to Chifley and Menzies, immediately post-war. But it's just funny that Anthony Albanese, if you just purely go by the data, has become the property investor's best friend. You've seen, people say, "Oh, well, no, it would be Scott Morrison. It would be Tony. It'd be somebody else." But it's Anthony Albanese who has delivered the highest level of investor credit growth in aggregate on a monthly annualized basis in a decade since 2015. And that was a great chart by Shane Oliver from AMP. And meanwhile, record numbers of investors buying properties. And how does that in any way help the cause of labor? The traditional cause of labor, which is, of homeownership, of a stake in society, of all these different things that, people like Chifley and Whitlam used to talk about. And Albo's like, no, property price go up, investor printer go brr.
Yeah, and just one other observation. If you look at the mix of property that investors bought, it's mostly established properties rather than newly built properties. So what it is doing is effectively moving the pieces on the board. It's not increasing the size of the board.
No, and that's a really big issue. And I think that's one of the things that people need to understand about how investors have evolved over time. If you go back to the sort of the start of some of the ABS data sets, which I was lucky enough to receive from someone in academia, if you go back to the mid-1980s, the sort of between the 1983 recession and the 1990s recession, and there was a point there where over 60% of new investor loans were to build new homes. As of the latest data, investors purchased only about 17% of their loans were to build new homes. The rest was on existing properties, according to the ABS. So, people say, "Oh, but investors play this role," and it's like, yes, they did, and some still do, to their credit. And generally speaking, to those people, kudos to them. Great job, you are performing a service for the nation. But for those who aren't, like you said, we're just shuffling pieces on the board.
One other factor to bear in mind, the data on lending for housing credit is only from the Australian banks. One of the things that's missing in all of this is that there are some people who are actually getting funding from overseas sources, overseas banks included, and including from a number of Asian areas. That is not included in these numbers, and that's something else which, again, is missing from the analysis.
Indeed it is. I mean, PECs are the sort of, what would you call them? The conveyancing facilitator, shall we say. Their data showed that about 1 in 4 properties in Australia was bought without a mortgage, at least without a mortgage that as you say, that's counted in the data. So that raises some rather interesting questions. Like, is that be it just people who are owner occupiers buying, or is it tilted to a more significant degree towards property investors, and people with sources of capital outside Australia? All of which are questions I think that are worth answering, but all are questions that are not getting the investigation that they perhaps deserve.
No, nobody wants to talk about it. Now, talking about something else that people don't want to talk about, let's look at some of the voting trends, right? Because this is fascinating, and particularly looking at millennials.
Indeed. Now, these numbers here are from the ANU election study, which they do every election cycle, and it's actually very, very interesting stuff. Unfortunately, from what I've seen, it isn't actually publicly released yet, but it has been released to the ABC, which is where that chart on the left is from. Now, I think one of the most fascinating things about that chart is it shows that that the coalition was surprisingly popular with millennial voters for quite some time, all the way up till the 2016 election. But since then, things have gone from bad to worse, to even worse again, to the point where now they're at a point where where at the last election, they're pretty much on par with the Greens for Gen Y voters, and that they were actually fell behind independents and other third parties. Meanwhile, Labor has performed relatively strongly. So in that, the coalition have got a problem. And I think that the chart on the right there, which I made based on one of the final news polls before the election back in May, shows, I think, one of the major reasons why. Because people in Gen Y were raised, and I speak as, very much from my own perspective on this as a member of this generation, but we were raised on this idea that the coalition was pro-home ownership. That if you worked hard, you got your head down, you did what you had to do, you saved a 20% deposit, you've got to buy a house. And, you would be rewarded for your hard work. And a lot of people are finding that frankly isn't true. And instead, they're stuck renting. And as the chart shows on the right there, renters favor Labor over the coalition by almost 2-1. So in a lot of ways, the coalition has committed electoral demographic suicide. And it's rather funny as well, because you look at some of these areas that they've lost, these former blue ribbon seats. You see that the increased densification, you see the increased, activity of, property investors buying up these single family homes, turning them into apartment complexes, townhouse complexes, generally in a lot of cases for renters. And then all these renters move in, and hey presto, it's a electoral demographic blow to the coalition, because these renters are significantly more likely to vote Labor. So nice work, idiots.
Now, the interesting question is, on the most recent data, is Labor now also being hit because they're not really delivering on the promises that they made post the previous, before the election? I don't know about that, but certainly some of the stuff I'm seeing in my surveys is that those under rental stress are basically saying both sides of governments haven't got our back. It doesn't matter, makes no difference, because they're both the same.
We haven't really seen that in the data. I mean, not in the ANU data anyway, with you look at Gen Z, you look at Gen Y, Labor hasn't really been punished on that in the way that one might expect. But in more recent times, we have seen a greater level of resurgence for third parties, for independents, for, in particular, One Nation, amongst a relatively increasing cross-section of the population. The question from here is, can One Nation and other, upstart third parties, can they capitalize on that in the way that other third parties have around the world? Say, for example, the Reform Party in the UK, can they build a stronger, more cohesive party that's actually going to be able to more meaningfully challenge the coalition for, its stance on the right? Or even, can another third party from the left come about who will challenge the Greens? Because that's what we've seen, for example, in Germany, where the Greens have been challenged and hit quite hard by the rise of left-wing populism.
Yeah, well, I think the chances of fragmentation ahead are quite significant. And if you actually want to try and root it into a fundamental issue, the real wages question, to me, is actually the key to understanding why people are actually feeling so dischuffed with what's going on. And this chart here really brings it home, doesn't it?
It does indeed. Now, I definitely have to give a shout out to Greg Jericho, who did the legwork on this chart and put the numbers together. And what it shows is real wages across time balanced to 100 in the first quarter of 2020. Now, the red is how things have transpired, and the dotted line in the black is the RBA's forecasts. Now, basically, this shows that the RBA is expecting 2 recessions in real wages, one starting in 2026 and another in 2027. And basically that we're going nowhere fast for quite some time to come. So I just think that's a rather concerning set of settings, really, because basically we're going to get to the end of 2027 based on these numbers, and we're still going to have real wages as if it's 2012. And I just think as well, it's just worth noting that these gains in real terms that some people are seeing, they're not evenly spread. Some people are doing, as you mentioned, very well, but then there are other people who are still very much falling behind.
Yeah, and I will just add that, of course, this is wages. So this is a particular category of income. The thing that's missing off this is the income from investments. And what you discover if you started then doing some cohort analysis is that there are some people, particularly more affluent people and older people, have done really well in terms of income from other sources, not from wages. And I'd also make the point that if you look at relative taxation, taxation of other types of investments is more generous than wages.
Well, it's interesting you should mention that because there was a study done on that recently. I forget exactly who it was by. Perhaps you might remember, but basically it showed that once you allow for the impact of taxation, it's got to the point now where a lot of retirees are better off than younger and cohorts. I believe it was either the 29 to 30, 34 or 34 to 39 cohort.
Mm.
I think the older cohorts, the 40s, the 50s are still generally speaking doing better, but the younger ones, the under 40s were falling behind in terms of actual disposable income, because if you're someone who's got a bunch of super or you've got a bunch of investments and you've got the right tax structures for them, then then as a retiree, you can make it so that that your actual taxable income is actually fairly negligible.
Absolutely, yes, and it's not rocket science to do that. And of course, a lot of people have had a bit of advice and a bit of help to structure it appropriately to maximize their post-tax outcome in later life. Unfortunately, people just earning, hand to mouth, don't have that same luxury and actually just getting charged more and more because the tax take is still rising. And I don't see how they're going to reverse that anytime soon, which takes you to the next point, was that, well, then, so how are people coping with unexpected expenditure? And that's what the next chart's about, because this is really fascinating and unfortunately quite concerning.
It is. Now, this has been taken from, I believe it was done by Resolve, and this chart is taken from the Sydney Morning Herald. And what it asks is if you had a major expense of a few $1,000s, say, for example, needing a new fridge, a new washing machine, or a major car repair, would you struggle to afford it? Now, back in February 2023, when this particular reporting started, 41% said that they would struggle, 46% said that they wouldn't. Now, as of the latest data, 61% now say they would struggle, and only 24% say that they wouldn't. Now, it's fair to say that this is not representative of, say, for example, total household spending, because as Martin previously mentioned, it's very much increasingly being, the growth is increasingly being driven by a relatively limited and increasingly wealthy cohort. But I think this does indicate that a lot of Australians are doing it tough, and that for them, I think that it could be that Christmas is quite a bit more limited this year, and that's that is also reflected in some of the other data that accompanied this in the Sydney Morning Herald.
Yeah, and I'll just add one other thing. It also means that people are looking for cheap deals and discounts. So Black Friday coming up will be very big. I expect more spending around Black Friday than at Christmas itself because of that. And again, people are actually on the lookout for cheap deals, discounts, cheaper goods, probably less quality goods in some cases, just to make the budget extend a little bit further, which is not necessarily always the best answer, but it's the answer that a lot of people are actually coping with at the moment, because that's the only thing they can do. So when I measure my stress, money in, money out, a lot of people have a deficit, which means they've got to actually do some rather difficult trade-offs between where they spend and what they don't spend and where they spend their money. So all of those things are there. And actually, if you make a comparison, interestingly, between the per capita spending and, say, the US, well, you can see there's a massive difference.
Indeed, you can. Now, just as a quick note on this, Australia's spending is deflated by the working age population, because Australia's population composition is changing quite significantly from pushing, more children out of the data and adding in more adults. And unfortunately, I haven't been able to find an equivalent number for the US. If someone does have that data, which is the working age population is people age 15 and over. And if anyone has a data set for that, just let me know in the comments below. I'd be very glad to talk to you about that. But anyway, what this shows is per capita spending from the end of 2018 until the present. Now, as you can see there, for the US, it has, with the exception of the pandemic, it has continued to trend upwards relatively strongly and relatively well. Whereas for Australia, we had obviously much more challenging times with lockdowns and stuff like that. So that shows there in the data. But after the bounce following the end of lockdowns ended, it's basically gone sideways for the next more than 3 years. So we're really going nowhere fast in that regard. So yeah, it's not a pretty picture, unfortunately.
Now and again, that's an average number, right? And again, I need to highlight, again, my data shows this. There's a huge diversity between per capita household spending from those who actually have a little more affluence and other income streams than younger people who don't. And in fact, there's a bifurcation that's getting worse. So real spending amongst some of those cohorts that are under financial pressure are continuing to go backwards in the situation where the costs of real goods are rising. So what it means is that their capacity to buy those goods is getting less and less. And Chalmers is sort of talking about income growth. Well, post-tax and post everything else, households, particularly in those less affluent groups, younger groups, have less capacity to spend now than they did a few years ago. And unfortunately, the trends look as though that's going to continue into the future. So there's no, way out. There's no sudden change in trajectory. It's going to be a slow grind, and that is what puts pressure on people. And that pressure, by the way, Tarric, leads to social disruption, breakdowns of relationships, and also rising crime. So there is a correlation in my surveys between high levels of stress and rising crime statistics, which I've been working on quite recently. So that's another angle on this as well.
Yeah, it's frustrating because I think one of the things is even if you take, say, for example, the US figure, right, which has seen a relatively meteoric rise compared with Australia's. If you look at a granular level at, say, the bottom 60% of Americans, their real spending really hasn't gone anywhere since 2019. So it's generally speaking the more affluent cohorts that are driving that growth. And that's, naturally, that's even more so here in Australia. And I mean, unfortunately, say, for example, like I do have the data from CBA, which breaks it down by age demographic. Now, don't get me wrong, that is very useful data. It shows that basically young people are being clobbered over the head and people who are over 65 are generally getting ahead. So, but it doesn't show what's happening within those cohorts. The people who are in, say, for example, the over 75 cohort who are going nowhere, who are struggling, who are just, who, say, for example, who are still in the rental market, who've seen their costs rise far, far higher than their payments have increased and the headline rate of inflation. But then by the same token, there's people, the 25 to 29 cohort who are doing exceedingly well, who are, growing their spending enormously, yet the 25 to 29 cohort is experiencing a technical depression compared with where they were in 2022. So we really, really need more data to not be flying blind on this. And we need timely data, not something that's, from Hilda from, a couple of years ago. We need something that's granular in the now. And this is something that the government could be working with the banks with to put together tomorrow. But somehow I think it's not going to produce terribly favorable numbers.
No, I'm not sure people want, people in power want this sort of data because it would actually point to too many issues. I have a bit of that in my surveys. And when you start pulling it apart and realizing, for example, buy, renting versus owning outright, or income bands and those sorts of things, what you begin to see is there's a hollow center. So there is a significant proportion of people who are really under the gun and have been for some time and will continue to be. And there are others doing quite a lot better. And interestingly, if you look at Canberra seems to be doing a little bit better than many other parts of the country at the moment. I wonder why that would be.
Well, it's nice being in the capital city bubble, isn't it? The fact that like, I mean, you've got a disproportionate number of workers in the public sector. You don't have that same sort of issues with feedback loops when the private sector starts to struggle, all these different things. Like you've got a lot more certainty about wage rises, promotions, all these sorts of things that people, that those of us in the private sector can only dream of. So, I mean, it's not really altogether surprising.
Plus, of course, you have stronger rental controls in Canberra too, which is another little observation. Last thought. I know this is a really, really. How much does it cost for a kid?
Yeah, this is a good one because recently Anthony Albanese started talking about the concept of universal childcare. This is something that The Guardian called basically his legacy project, something that he's going to be remembered for. And one of the problems with federal childcare subsidies is that they have been undergoing an absolutely meteoric rise. Now, what I've done is I've gone through all the various reports from the Department of Education since the end of 2019, and I've charted the growth in the average cost of the childcare subsidy per child in care. And as you can see, it is more than 3 times the rate of inflation. So I'm concerned that Albo's plan for universal childcare, which could potentially, some people have speculated, could take the guise of a capped $10 a day fee payable by the parents, and then the rest will be paid by the government. I'm concerned that this could basically end up a rerun of the NDIS, whereby something that is well-intentioned and intended to help ends up being an expensive boondoggle. Because frankly, the growth in the childcare subsidy per child is already looking rather NDIS-like, to be completely frank.
Very important point there. And I understand it's important to provide appropriate help to parents, particularly to, oil the wheels, because having a kid is blooming expensive. And interesting, in the UK, there's a big debate at the moment because at the moment there is some support for the first kid and the second kid, but no more. They actually turned it off a few years ago because there were a lot of people who they claimed were having big families to get more money, although I'm not sure the evidence really ever proved that. But there is a big debate going on in the UK about, should we be pressurizing kid 3, kid 4, et cetera, simply because the government says we're not going to pay any money for it. So, but if you open the aperture there and deal with the real costs, because the real costs are rising so fast, it's going to be another NDIS, isn't it?
It is. I mean, like, whether you look at it at a per child level, which I think is probably the best way to go about it, but even if you just look at the aggregate level, that the rise has been absolutely meteoric. And I don't really see how how that's going to change, because the problem is that once you give the private sector a contract that basically says we're going to basically keep paying you more and more money forever, they're going to demand more and more money forever. And it's not like you even, okay, like even some of the wage increases for childcare have in some cases been higher than inflation, depending on the award. But it's still under a third of the cost, the rising cost per child. So it's not coming from rising wages that's the driving force. So it's really just a deeply, deeply broken issue that I think throwing money at is just going to end up resulting in just more money going down the drain and things not being improved. And unfortunately, I take absolutely no satisfaction in saying this because it's deeply sad and deeply concerning. But you look at the childcare sector and some of the horrible things that are happening there, and how just there are just so many deep, deep failings for these children and their parents. And, it's like, okay, you need to, first off, maybe you guys need to be focusing on fixing that. And that in and of itself is going to cost an absolutely ungodly sum of money, because right now you've got people coming in, like at the absolute worst. I mean, this is reported in the Fairfax papers recently, but you've got people coming in and getting dodgy childcare qualifications and then going to work in childcare. I mean, that's insane. Like children are our most, our most important resource. They are our future. And we're handing them off to people with dodgy qualifications. Potentially tens of thousands of them. And that to me is just, to use a word that some people may disagree with, I think it's bloody criminal.
Absolutely. Well, in the UK, about a quarter of kids are in what's called child poverty at the moment. Quarter. That's a huge proportion of the number of kids out there. And again, a lot of lip service from politicians, but real action hardly anywhere being seen. And there's a lot of promises to fix things, but then you actually say, well, so what have you done? What have you really done? And are you really putting the levers in the right way? And I come back to a broader point. If you think about politicians and politics, they have a series of choices to make about the money that's coming in and where it's spent. And those choices are somewhat wired because of what's happened previously, but also have flexibility if you chose to do something different. And what I don't get is why politicians seem to just want to pave the cow paths and just continue to do the same old, and say stuff, but do something different. It's almost like, they go into power and they turn their brains off. I don't know what's going on there, but there's something deeply worrying.
That there is. And I think part of the problem is that I think the thing is that there's a vested interest behind just about everything these days. If you start rocking the boat, if you start, moving against anything, because you look at these policies, you're not talking about chump change. You look at, say for example, like, this policy, you're talking about for something that costs, that next year's going to cost over $15 billion.
Yeah.
It's like it's getting on for, in short order, it's going to be almost a third of the defense budget. Like it's not small bananas. And if you start messing with that, if you start taking the cost base, for the government, its growth back down towards inflation, then it's going to start annoying people. And that's going to really get in the way of you getting reelected. And, I think that's one of the deepest indictments of the current government, to be honest. It's like you have 94 seats. You have the biggest Labor majority in something like almost 80 years. And what's your big play? What are you going to spend that political capital on? Are you going to do anything with it? Labor has come up with all these various different policies over the years of things that they want to change, things that they want to reform, things that they want to fix. And okay, go for it. Crack on. The floor is yours, because there's never, ever going to be a better time than now.
Spot on. But unfortunately, we prefer the keep our head down, don't rock the boat too much. We'll just do a little bit here and there. And, we'll float things like productivity. Remember the productivity discussion from 2 or 3 months ago? Well, that went somewhere, didn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, and that's the thing, though. If they don't rock the boat, there is entirely the possibility that Australia ends up becoming a single-party state solely due to the incompetence of the coalition. And Labor, and Albanese just talks about, basically Labor being, his desire for Labor to be in power for the foreseeable future. I mean, I get that. He's a Labor Prime Minister. You kind of expect that, but it's just like that could happen if the incompetence continues. And the thing is that the coalition need to face off and defeat their demons and their vested interests just as much as Labor does. In fact, for them, it's downright existential. The government can do bugger all, and electoral demographics favour them. Oh, well, we made some more renters. Oh, well, they'll vote for us. They won't vote for the coalition. Whereas for the coalition, if things keep going the way they're going, You know, they're going to be like the Tories in the UK. They're going to become an endangered species.
Absolutely. Tarric, been a very interesting conversation as always. And, I come back to a simple observation. Until we actually get real political focus down at the granular level and we have data that supports us understanding, and the media more broadly understanding what's really going on down at the ground level, we're going to continue to be gaslit by politicians who say one thing and do another. And there's no check or balance in the process at the moment. And unfortunately, Australia's going to be the poorer because of it.
Indeed. Now, just a quick message. If there is a billionaire out there who wants to have a Renaissance-style patronage relationship and build this data network, let Martin know. We'd love to work with you.
Absolutely. We already have quite a lot of data and a lot of sources, right? As with all of these things, a bit of extra investment would make a huge, huge difference to what we could do and the insights we could bring, because there's nobody else who's doing the sort of granular analysis that we're doing and trying to get under the hood and understand what's really, really going on. Why? Because we want to understand. Whereas I suspect that some of the other top-down analysts prefer not to. They prefer to average and they prefer to say, on the whole, everything's looking pretty good. Well, that is not going to really cut the mustard as we go into the next couple of years, in my view.
Well, there you go. Jeff, Elon, if you can help us out, hit Martin up.
Tarric, great. Thank you very much. Look forward to the next one. Take care.
You too, mate. Have a good one.
Cheers.